Welcome back, and happy holidays from Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, and if you are new to this podcast, Dead Sleep is an ad-free, independent podcast made for anyone who likes to unwind their mind with a real-life mystery that's gripping, never gory, made by an experienced journalist, that's me, with no distracting ads, just plenty of depth and details to intrigue and fatigue. And being ad-free makes the whole experience better for you and for me. And guess what? I don't need advertisers or sponsors because I have you, the listener. So if you like this show and you want to keep it going, I strongly encourage you to support Dead Sleep for $5 a month. And if you're not sure, please enjoy a free month on Apple Podcasts or a free 7-day trial on Patreon. And if you don't want to, that's totally fine. You can still enjoy 80 episodes. Well, actually 81 if we include this one. 81 episodes for free, no ads. I'm not here to twist anyone's arm. So if you like the show and want to support it, it's totally up to you. Again, that's Apple Podcasts, Patreon, and Spotify. More on that in the show notes. And now, on to tonight's episode. Back by popular demand, it's Dead Sleep's Forensic Files Flashback. That's my tribute to the original true crime series that got a lot of us falling asleep to true crime in our youth. If you haven't seen Forensic Files or don't know what it is, it doesn't really matter. You can enjoy this episode all the same. Of course, this is the highly detailed Dead Sleep version of events with my own twist on things. I always encourage you to compare and contrast. And I chose tonight's episode because the woman at the center of this story, her name was Gail Islip. And Gail, well, her favorite holiday was Christmas. Gail Islip loved Christmas so much, she kept little ornaments around the house year-round. And when Christmas Day finally arrived, Gail loved to host, sometimes staying up all night getting things ready for her grandchildren, all 9 of them. And her beautiful colonial home, located just outside of Hartford, Connecticut. During the holidays, that house was always filled with the aroma of freshly baked pie. The last Christmas Gail Islip ever enjoyed was 1995, back when Gail was around 54, and she'd reached that perfect midlife age. Gail was old enough to take pride in her 4 adult children, including her daughter Merritt, with whom she had a close relationship, old enough to be a grandmother, everybody's favorite Grammy, but young enough to be the fun one who could keep up with the kids, playing with them in her tennis shoes and jeans, her head of blonde corkscrew curls and stylish flair, giving her the appearance of a kid herself. And she was also young enough to build a new life for herself with her 3rd husband, Doug. The two had been married for 3 years, and Doug and Gail appeared cozy and content, living together in their charming small town of Manchester. And Christmas in Connecticut, you just can't beat it. But in the spring of 1996, something changed. Merritt, her daughter, she couldn't help but notice. Her mother, Gail, seemed closed off. The woman who drew the world to her suddenly seemed to want nothing more than to block it out. She seemed agitated, even paranoid. But when Merritt asked her about it, she said it was nothing. But there were little signs, moments, when it wasn't nothing. To Merritt, it was obviously something. Like when the phone rang. And Gail, she'd tense up. And if one of her daughters wondered if she was going to answer it, Gail would shake her head and say no. just let the phone ring. Merritt, she respected her mother's wishes, as did her other children. But somewhere in the back of their minds, that little seed of concern took root. Was there something going on with Mom? And if so, what? Could it be another man calling on that phone? No. Gail and her relatively new husband, Doug, seemed so happy together. Gail and Doug met roughly 7 years earlier as Gail weathered through her second divorce. She didn't enter marriage for the third time lightly. Doug was the one. Was it a bill collector? Gail and Doug didn't appear to have any financial problems. Doug had retired comfortably, and recently Gail took a job, working retail, to make a little extra money on the side. So what was she avoiding? Soon there was another clue. The windows. Spring in Connecticut, it always meant flowers, purple tulips and bright yellow daffodils. But when Merritt came to her mother's house one day, Gail was doing everything she could to block the light out. Curtains and blinds weren't enough. Merritt watched, disturbed, as her mother tried to cover all the windows in the living room with heavy blankets. When she asked her why, her answer was unsettling. Gail told Merritt that you just never knew who was out there, looking into their windows. But Gail and Doug, they lived in a quiet neighborhood, their house set back from the street. If someone wanted to look into these windows, they'd have to make a fair amount of effort, and no doubt someone in this tight-knit neighborhood would notice. Maybe the problem wasn't someone on the outside looking in. Maybe the problem was with the person looking out. Whether we like it or not, there usually comes a point in every kid's life where you, as the adult child, realize you now have to parent your parents, that they behave a little differently, that something's off, they're not themselves. And Gail was relatively young, just 54, but maybe, shudder to think, it was rare. But there were cases of people under 65 developing early onset Alzheimer's. And Gail was exhibiting some of the classic signs: agitation, paranoia, a suspicion of others, and withdrawing from the outside world. Or maybe they were the ones being paranoid. Her kids knew that sometimes Gail could be hard to read. Gail gave to everyone, but it seemed like she kept a part of herself, a lot of herself, to herself. But the more Merritt and her siblings brought it up, the more likely Gail was to say, "Everything's fine. Don't make something out of nothing." And so everyone went about their busy lives. This included Gail, who by then was working late night shifts at Walmart. Gail had spent most of her career working as an office manager for a large company until it went out of business. And this Walmart gig, it was a strange turn, but she seemed to enjoy it. She worked in the shoe department and then in jewelry. Gail loved fashion, she loved people, so it seemed a perfect fit. And by all accounts, she was well liked by everyone. So what exactly was wrong with Gail, nobody really knew. And maybe it was just to appease her, but her husband Doug did install motion sensor lights outside of the home. And they had a couple of dogs too. And he would later remember an occasion or two when the lights would flash on, the dogs would go crazy. But when he would go and look, there was nobody there. So they knew it wasn't nothing, it was something. But what? That was the mystery. Until one night, in April of 1996, that nothing became something. Something scary, something dark, and something deadly. April 30th, 1996, at around 10:45 p.m. When Doug Islip called the Manchester police, he said definitively and plainly over the phone that there was a robbery happening at his house and that someone had shot at his wife. When the police arrived, what they saw was much more than a robbery. What they saw were the remains of a bizarre and violent encounter. In the driveway of the Islib's colonial home was a dark green Jeep Cherokee. The left side, the driver's side, the door was now open, but the window was already shattered, broken pieces of window glass all over the asphalt, suggesting that someone had either broken or shot through that glass. Inside the car on the driver's side was their victim. The driver was 54-year-old Gail Islib, in her jeans and tennis shoes, a red tracksuit-style jacket, the upper half of her body tilted far to her right side, almost leaning into the passenger seat. It appeared Gail had been shot moments after pulling into her driveway. Gail's husband, Doug, said he heard 7 pops, which tracked with what was found at the crime scene. 7 .22 caliber casings scattered all around the driver's side of Gail's Jeep. Doug also said he heard a car horn, one long honk, which suggested Gail attempted to call for help within moments of the attack. Doug, that's Gail's husband, said he was inside their home when it happened. He was watching TV when he heard the shots, heard the car horn. Then, he said he ran outside to see what was happening, and he saw a man. In his recollection, Doug said he believed it was a young Hispanic or Latino male in his 20s or 30s. But he regretted he didn't get a good look at his face. It was impossible to look at his face. This man, Doug said, wore a mask. One of the toughest, but most important jobs for a detective is to think the thoughts that no one else wants or dares to think. And in this case, the lead detective's thoughts, well, he couldn't help but notice a few inconsistencies with Doug's story. Ones that by now, most of us in the true crime world can instantly spot. There was the first phone call, the one to 911, where Doug announced, practically, that what was happening was a robbery. And he said it relatively calmly and with such confidence. One had to wonder, how did Doug know? From the outside, it appeared as if Doug were suggesting a narrative, thinking of the story first and the welfare of his wife second, front-loading the situation with too much information, leaving the most important detail, that his wife had been shot, as secondary information. What's more, when police checked the car, Gail's purse and her jewelry, they were still there. If this had been a robbery, the thieves would have demanded this before they shot Gail. And while Gail was a tough New Englander, born and raised in Maine, and taught how to take care of herself, she was also the kind of person who valued her life above things. She would have easily given her possessions away if this were a matter of life or death. A wedding ring, a handbag, it was nothing more important than being able to live. So whoever did it, they left her jewelry and purse behind. And then there was Doug's description of this possible suspect. It wouldn't be the first time a guilty white guy would try and pin the blame on some generic, non-existent Hispanic male. Then there was the gun. One thing police knew for certain. At the crime scene, there were 7 shell casings from a .22 caliber weapon. And when police asked Doug, could he show them his gun, the one that he said he grabbed when all of this commotion was happening? And when Doug showed them the gun, it turned out that it too was a .22 caliber. This wasn't good for Doug. It seemed a little too convenient that he just happened to own the very same gun that police believed was used to kill his wife. Then detectives took a closer look, both at Doug's gun and the shell casings. And they quickly amended that first impression. Doug's gun, it was a .22 caliber pistol. And those types of guns, they don't discharge shell casings. The gun used in this murder was a .22 caliber rifle. So the authorities, at least for the moment, they wouldn't take Doug seriously as a person of interest, and they moved on to another possibility. One that was top of mind in the mid-1990s, a relatively new phenomenon called road rage. Of course, the notion of feeling frustration at other people on the road, that wasn't new. Drivers have shaken their fists in fury at those who cut them off since the days of the horse and buggy. And the term road rage had gained traction by the 1980s. But it was only in the 1990s that reported incidences of driver aggression that led to physical violence was first published by the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. And around the time of Gail's death, there were some shocking incidences of seemingly ordinary people. Motorists who could not regulate their sense of frustration and snapped. At the time, there was a recent instance of a pregnant woman driving a Jeep Cherokee who accidentally tapped the other Jeep Cherokee in front of her, and, enraged, the man got out of his car and punched this pregnant woman in the face. The man was soon arrested and charged with assault. Also in the mid-1990s, when Oscar winner Jack Nicholson lost control when a Mercedes-Benz apparently cut him off in traffic. The then 57-year-old actor grabbed a golf club, stepped out of his car at a red light, and repeatedly struck the windshield and roof of the Mercedes. And some of these high-profile cases in the mid-1990s didn't even happen while people were driving. There was another event in Seattle, Washington, where a 57-year-old man shot and killed a 21-year-old college student because the student couldn't figure out how to disarm the blaring anti-theft alarm on his Jeep. Gail also had a Jeep, but the only sound Doug heard was one long horn blaring. And now he was certain Gail had leaned on that horn after the altercation began. In fact, Doug believed, with enormous regret, that she'd blared that horn as a cry for help. And Doug would ruefully remember how he was inside, in full suburban dad mode, comfy in his slippers, feet up and watching TV, and how he heard the commotion, that horn, rushing out there only after the bullets were fired, when it was too late. The possibility of road rage, it would at least potentially help them find their suspect. Doug's description of a young male in his 20s and 30s fit the general profile of most aggressive drivers. Dating back to that study back in the 1990s, the majority of individuals whose aggressive driving escalated into violence, they were relatively young men in their teens, 20s, and 30s, many of whom had criminal records, histories of violence, and drug or alcohol problems. It was not unusual in these extreme cases of road rage, where a friend or a relative would describe these individuals as odd or disenfranchised or a loner. So, a possible scenario took shape. That sometime after 10 o'clock, when Gail got off work, either at her car in the parking lot or later on her way home, it was just a half-mile drive, she'd had some type of encounter with a young man along the lines of Doug's physical description, and that man followed her home. Thankfully, Doug wasn't the only witness. Nearby neighbors also confirmed that they too had seen a young male wearing a mask, and there was another detail. That witnesses said he took off in a white car. And no one was able to catch the license plate. It was too dark. But at least it was a starting point. So the police at least knew half of the equation. It was obvious, by the nature of Gail's injuries, that she was shot point blank. That whoever did this, they had plenty of rage. But whether this was indeed road rage, to find that out, they'd need to retrace Gail's steps. They'd have to start at the beginning. Walmart. At 7 a.m., the second Walmart opened. The lead detective was there, speaking to anyone he could find, all of the employees, about what they knew, what they saw, what could they say about Gail Islib. And everyone said, everyone loved her. There was no enemies that they knew about. And they certainly hadn't known of any altercation that might have happened in the parking lot. Everybody loved Gail. And detectives would soon discover there was one individual who loved Gail a little too much. At first, Tyrone Montgomery seemed friendly, an eager 25-year-old kid who just wanted some attention. At 54, Gail was old enough to be Tyrone's mother. And for a while, it seemed, Tyrone appreciated Gail's maturity and mentorship. She saw him as not a son exactly, but as someone who benefited from guidance. But soon, Tyrone became infatuated with Gail, in a romantic way that was most assuredly not reciprocated. And while Gail didn't say anything, other employees noticed. Tyrone was harassing her. One employee said they once saw Tyrone try to put his arm around Gail. Another employee said that Gail asked to be transferred out of the shoe department into jewelry to get away from Tyrone. Someone else noticed that Tyrone would come in on his days off and hang out in the shoe department talking to Gail. And Gail had mentioned Tyrone Montgomery and the problems she was having with him to her family. But each time she made it seem like it wasn't a big deal and that she had it handled. And whatever the case, Gail did not tell her family just how extreme Tyrone's harassment had become. Gail sensed that Tyrone was stalking her. And when her family looked back, they'd realize, of course, it was Tyrone she was afraid of. And Doug would, of course, only later realize that those times when the motion-censored lights went off in the backyard and the dogs barked like mad, that it was likely Tyrone roaming the property. And with this realization came an enormous sense of guilt for Gail's husband and her children. The if-onlys. If only they had listened to her more. If only they'd pushed her harder to tell them what was happening. If only she could have seen them as people, as friends she could trust, and not children she had to protect. By then, everybody knew that Tyrone Montgomery was their suspect. But Doug, he saw himself as an unwitting accomplice. That many times Gail had asked him to clean the garage so she could park her car inside, and he just hadn't gotten around to it. If only he'd done as she asked and just cleaned out the garage, she could have pulled right in and shut the door. And Doug was convinced she'd still be alive today. No one would ever know for certain why Gail never reported Tyrone to her manager at Walmart. It appears that Gail tried discreetly by asking to change departments from shoes to jewelry in an effort to put some distance between Gail and Tyrone. But it's possible that Gail wasn't sure what would happen if she complained about Tyrone. Walmart had a lackluster reputation when it came to its employees. And around this time, in the mid-1990s, Walmart was embroiled in some pretty petty employee scandals. One of the most notorious instances was when Walmart fired employees for stealing candy. Walmart had installed security cameras that recorded the goings-on in the employee break room. And it appears someone had left behind a damaged package that was filled with candy. The notion being that it was damaged, it couldn't be sold, and instead of throwing it away, the employees would eat it. But what they saw as less waste, Walmart perceived as stealing. It's worth noting that those employees later sued Walmart for wrongful discharge and defamation, claiming they were publicly humiliated and marched past customers and coworkers during their termination, and used as an example to other employees as a, quote, warning. And they actually won $20 million in damages. But you can imagine being an employee with a serious and complicated issue, worrying that if you complain to your boss, that you too might be fired and made an example of. This was 1996, and while there was landmark legislation to protect women from sexual harassment in the workplace, in practice, it wasn't necessarily enforced. Gail couldn't risk it. She needed the job. And so she decided if she ignored Tyrone, eventually he'd go away. And in his own twisted way, this proved to be true. The day after Gail's murder, when detectives went looking for Tyrone, they learned Tyrone Montgomery had not shown up for work that day. And when they went to his house, there was a white Mitsubishi Mirage in the driveway, but there was nobody home. Less than 12 hours after Gail's murder, and Tyrone Montgomery had vanished. Wherever Tyrone was, he left some damning evidence in his wake. And officers obtained a search warrant to look inside the car for clues. What they found was a trove that chronicled his obsession. Handwritten notes, including what appeared to be a checklist of items he needed to execute his highly orchestrated plan of attack. Only what was on this list was quite different than the reality. Starting with Tyrone's intended victim. Going by this handwritten checklist, which included items to purchase like duct tape, mace, and an ice pick. These handwritten pages also contained his apparent cover story, that he was going to pretend to be returning a cake dish to Gail's house. A cake that Tyrone would say Gail baked for him and his fiancée. But of course there was no cake. No fiancé. Tyrone Montgomery, by all accounts, was the kind of creep most women his age would instinctively avoid. But Gail, she'd been kind to him. A kindness he willfully misinterpreted as something more. As detectives literally pieced together these shreds of handwritten notes, some of them burned into scraps and stuffed into the Mitsubishi's ashtray, it seemed the original plan was to go to Doug and Gail's house. If Doug came to the door, he would pretend he was kindly returning this cake dish, gain access to the home, then incapacitate Doug and their dogs with mace, duct tape, and then, detectives theorized, he planned to kill Doug using an ice pick. It seemed Tyrone Montgomery was also experienced with disguises. In his home, police actually found a book that was titled Masters of Disguise. In addition to the mask that he apparently wore that night, in the back seat of his car, detectives found pieces of women's clothing and a woman's wig. A search of his home revealed more evidence. Spent shell casings, the exact ones that matched the .22 caliber rifle, just like the casings found at the scene. He also owned a copy of an obscure cult book titled Hitman, a technical manual for independent contractors. They'd soon discovered Tyrone's crime was a one-stop shop. He was able to secure nearly all of the things he needed to target Gail and Doug from Walmart, from the cake dish to the latex gloves to the duct tape, the women's clothing, even the gun. Though the man who sold Tyrone that gun was so panicked when he found out what had happened, he thwarted the police's investigation initially because he tampered with evidence. He tried to erase any trace of Tyrone's purchase of that rifle at Walmart, so he, the employee himself, wouldn't get in trouble. But perhaps his conscience got the best of him, and when detectives confronted the salesman, he finally admitted yes, Tyrone Montgomery had indeed purchased the weapon from this department, from that employee. But he swore he had no idea what he planned to do with it. Somehow, even after gathering all of these items on his checklist, the plan changed, as did the target of Tyrone's rage. Maybe they'd had a confrontation in the Walmart parking lot, and Gail rebuffed him one last time. So he followed her home, and Gail, aware that he was following her, pulled into her driveway and tried to stay in her car for her safety, leaning on her horn to get her husband to come out. But Tyrone, he was determined, and within seconds of that horn, he was right there, on the side of her car, .22 caliber rifle directly at her. 7 blasts that shattered the car window and Gail's life and the lives of everyone in her family into 1,000 pieces. So it seemed they knew more or less what happened. They had the evidence, these letters, the gun. Now they just needed Tyrone Montgomery himself. The question now was, if he wasn't at home, he wasn't at Walmart, and he wasn't in custody, where could Tyrone Montgomery be? Haunted, spooky, damned, condemned. Those are the words that they used to describe the Cedar Crest Regional Hospital now. But decades ago, it was known as the Hartford County Home for the Care and Treatment of Persons Suffering from Tuberculosis. And back in 1910, that's why the building was built. Its original purpose: a sanatorium for people to stay and heal. By the 1970s, however, Cedar Crest became a mental hospital, one that could accommodate 128 patients. And in early May of 1996, one of those 128 patients was a troubled young man named Tyrone Montgomery. It seems he fled to this psychiatric facility like Quasimodo to Notre Dame, a place where he sought sanctuary, where he told the medical staff that a close friend of his had just died, and he was so distraught over her death, he was contemplating taking his own life. They, of course, admitted him, and it was there, at this psychiatric hospital, where detectives finally tracked Tyrone Montgomery down. As the detective sat across from this laconic young man who gave one-word responses in a soft-spoken whisper, it was hard for them to know if Tyrone Montgomery really was suffering from some terrible mental breakdown, or if he was really crazy like a fox. They had a lot of circumstantial evidence. But what they were missing, the thing that would clinch this arrest, was proof that it was indeed Tyrone Montgomery who was there at the crime scene that night. And to get that proof, they would need Tyrone himself, at the very least the clothing he wore, to see if they could find any type of blood spatter or gun residue. But gathering that evidence would prove impossible. The hospital had already laundered those clothes, and when the police asked for them and they handed them over, they'd already been cleaned. And therefore, any hope of finding trace evidence that they could use to prove that he was there that night, it washed away. And if they couldn't prove that he was there, he was going to get away with this. As the detectives were about to leave, they learned there was actually one possession that the hospital had that they hadn't touched. Actually, it was a pair of items. Tyrone Montgomery's Timberland work boots. These humble boots were their only hope for breaking this case. And somewhere in a forensic lab, an eagle-eyed analyst noticed little tiny pieces of glass lodged into the grooves in the tread of Tyrone's boots. Now, to the naked eye, little shards of glass from, say, a car window, they all look the same. And this kind of glass can be found all over the street in any city. But under the expert gaze of a trace evidence examiner named Virginia Maxwell, she had a method of examining these tiny pieces of glass using something called the refractive index. And the refractive index, simply put, is a way to measure the speed of light. Look at a straw in a glass of water, and it looks bent. When in truth, it looks that way because the speed of light in water is different than the speed of light in air. So what did that mean for the pieces of glass that were found at the crime scene and the pieces of glass found in Tyrone's boots? Well, what Virginia Maxwell needed to prove was that both samples of glass had the same refractive index. And to do this, she smashed the glass of both samples into tiny, tiny, tiny little fragments, almost to dust. And after she did that, she took each sample and put them on 2 different slides. She added silicone oil and then heated each slide to the same exact temperature. Once heated to a certain temperature, she could compare the refractive index. And in short, she discovered that the refractive index between the 2 slides, they were the same. Now, this wasn't 100% foolproof, but what it did do was suggest a very high probability that the glass found in Tyrone's boots was the same glass that was found at the crime scene, the glass from Gail's window, which essentially placed Tyrone Montgomery at the scene of the crime that night. So with that evidence that was found on his person, along with the shell casings, along with the forensic document examiner, who compared Tyrone Montgomery's handwriting on his job application for Walmart with the handwriting that was seen on those letters found inside his car, this forensic document examiner determined it was the same handwriting. And all of that evidence compiled together helped, in part, convict Tyrone Montgomery when the case went to trial. And he was found guilty in the murder of Gail Islib. And he was sentenced to roughly 65 years in prison. And he remains incarcerated at a facility in Connecticut to this day. Anyone who researches this story will notice that Gail's family, they didn't speak to the press at all until after the verdict. And once they did, they only really spoke to 2 sources, a Hartford-based newspaper and Forensic Files. And they said that they did this for really one reason. They wanted to speak out as a tribute to their mother, and they urged anyone who tends to not want to make something out of nothing to realize that the something could one day mean everything. Thank you, as always, for listening. I will be back next week. Until then, nighty-night.